A routine gas stop turns into an unlawful detention when a cop accuses a judge of stealing his own car. The badge reveal changes everything. Before we start, please hit the subscribe button. The afternoon sun hung low over Highway 19, casting long shadows across the asphalt as Judge Nathaniel Briggs pulled his midnight blue Range Rover into the Shell station. At 53 years old, he'd long since grown accustomed to the weight of his robe, the gravity of his decisions, and the respect his position commanded. But on this particular Thursday evening, none of that would matter. He was just a man filling his tank. The pump clicked rhythmically as fuel flowed into his vehicle. Briggs loosened his tie, feeling the day's tension ease from his shoulders. He'd spent the last 6 hours presiding over a complex civil case, and all he wanted now was to get home to a quiet dinner and perhaps a glass of wine. Simple pleasures, ordinary moments. He didn't notice the patrol cruiser slow down as it passed the station. He didn't see Officer Mark Reick's eyes lock onto his vehicle with the intensity of a predator spotting prey. He didn't witness the subtle shift in the officer's posture, the way his hands tightened around the steering wheel, or the decision that flashed across his face. But he would feel all of it soon enough. The cruiser's tires screeched as Reick made a sharp U-turn, cutting across 2 lanes to pull into the gas station. He parked diagonally, blocking the Range Rover's exit, his vehicle positioned like a barrier rather than a professional stop. The aggressive maneuver made Briggs glance up from the pump, his eyebrows raising slightly, not in alarm but in quiet confusion. Officer Mark Reick stepped out with the swagger of someone who believed he'd already caught a criminal. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask if everything was all right. His eyes swept over the luxury SUV with undisguised skepticism, then landed on Briggs with an expression that said everything words didn't need to. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." The command cut through the evening air like a blade. Briggs blinked, his hand still resting on the fuel pump. "I'm sorry, officer, is there a problem?" Reick didn't answer the question. Instead, he circled the Range Rover slowly, deliberately, running his palm across the hood as if checking for evidence of a crime. He crouched to examine the license plate, then straightened and shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them," Reick announced, his voice carrying across the lot. "We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in multiple thefts." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Briggs felt something cold settle in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. He'd heard this tone before, seen this approach play out in countless cases that crossed his bench. The assumption of guilt. The presumption that someone like him couldn't possibly belong behind the wheel of a vehicle like this. "This vehicle?" Briggs asked carefully, keeping his voice level. "Officer, I think there's been." "Where'd you get this car?" Reick interrupted, stepping closer. The question wasn't curious. It was loaded with implication, dripping with the unspoken belief that theft was the only logical explanation. Briggs exhaled slowly through his nose, choosing his words with the precision he used in his courtroom. "I purchased it 3 years ago. It's registered in my name. The insurance paperwork is in the glove compartment if you'd like to." "Is that so?" Reick tilted his head, his skepticism palpable. "Mind if I check?" "Do you have probable cause to search my vehicle?" The question landed like a challenge, and Reich's expression darkened. "Yeah," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're standing next to a car that doesn't belong to you." Briggs felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was profiling, pure and simple, wrapped in the thin veneer of law enforcement authority. Behind the glass doors of the convenience store, the attendant had stopped restocking shelves to watch the confrontation unfold. A woman at Pump 6 paused mid-transaction, her eyes darting between the officer and the man being questioned. Even the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with the tension of something wrong taking place in plain sight. "I'm going to need your identification," Reick demanded, moving even closer. Briggs nodded slowly, his movements deliberate and visible. "I'm not refusing to cooperate, officer, but I would appreciate knowing why this stop is happening." "Because," Reick snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin, "this vehicle was reported stolen 15 minutes ago." The claim was absurd. Briggs had been downtown in the courthouse parking lot for the entire afternoon, his vehicle in clear view of security cameras. "Who filed that report?" he asked, his legal training taking over. Reick ignored the question. Instead, he reached for the door handle of the Range Rover, expecting it to open under his touch. It didn't. Briggs had locked it out of habit when he stepped out to pump gas. The officer tugged again, harder this time. "Unlock it." No, the single word was firm, unwavering. "You don't have the right to search it." The standoff crystallized in that moment, two men separated by a locked car door and an ocean of assumptions. The overhead lights hummed their monotonous song. A truck rumbled past on the highway, and somewhere in the background, a phone camera quietly began recording. Reich's hand drifted toward his holster, not touching his weapon but hovering close enough to send a message. His shoulders squared, his jaw set. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And I'm telling you," Briggs replied, his own voice steady despite the escalating tension, "you're making a mistake." For a brief moment, their eyes locked. The judge saw something flickering in the officer's gaze, not uncertainty exactly, but a flash of recognition that this wasn't going according to script. The man he'd assumed would cower or comply was instead standing his ground with the calm authority of someone who understood the law better than Reick ever would. But rather than de-escalate, the officer doubled down. He thumbed the radio clip to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, confirming a suspected stolen vehicle at Highway 19 gas stop. Request backup." The words crackled through the static, official and damning. To anyone listening, it sounded like a legitimate call. But to Briggs, who had spent decades in courtrooms dissecting police procedure, it was a fabrication being documented in real time. "Officer Reick," Briggs said, his composure holding even as anger simmered beneath the surface. "I'm asking you again, what makes you think this vehicle is stolen?" Reick circled the SUV a second time, tapping the roof with one hand as if inspecting merchandise. "Because people don't just drive cars like this around here unless something's off." There it was, laid bare, not evidence, not reasonable suspicion, just assumption based on skin color and the belief that certain people didn't belong in certain vehicles. "That's not probable cause," Briggs said quietly. "That's profiling." The words seemed to bounce off Reick without effect. He crouched to examine the VIN plate through the windshield, squinting as if he might find some discrepancy that would justify his actions. He found nothing. Still, he didn't back down. "What did you say your name was again?" Reick asked, still studying the vehicle. "You haven't asked for my name yet." "Well, then give it." Briggs reached into his jacket pocket with careful, visible movements and produced his wallet. He held it out, and Reick snatched it without a word of thanks. The officer flipped it open, and for just a fraction of a second, his eyebrows twitched upward when he saw the identification inside. "Honorable Nathaniel Briggs, State Superior Court." The word honorable should have meant something. In any other circumstance, it would have triggered immediate recognition, immediate deference. But Reich's pride had already carried him too far down this path to turn back now. He handed the ID back with barely a glance. "Still doesn't mean the car is yours." Briggs inhaled slowly, measuring his next words. "My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. You can view them, but only if you acknowledge you're searching based on my consent, not force." "Don't try to lecture me on procedure," Reick shot back, his tone mocking. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Backup was arriving. What should have been a simple interaction was now spiraling into something far more serious. The small crowd that had gathered at the edges of the lot shifted uneasily, phones held up, capturing every moment. "Officer, you're escalating a situation that didn't need escalation," Briggs said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this scenario play out too many times. "No," Reick snapped. "You escalated it when you lied about owning this vehicle." "Exactly what have I lied about?" The question hung unanswered as a second patrol car pulled into the lot. Officer Jansen emerged, younger, broader, his expression unreadable as he assessed the scene. He approached quickly, his eyes moving between the two men. "What's the situation?" Jansen asked. "Possibly stolen vehicle," Reick replied without hesitation, "drivers being uncooperative." Briggs turned to face the new officer, speaking with the same measured clarity. "I provided identification, I offered paperwork, I refused an unlawful search." Jansen looked at Reick, then at the Range Rover, then back at Briggs. His positioning told the story. He moved to stand beside Reick, not as a neutral party but as reinforcement. "Sir," Jansen said firmly, "step away from the car." "I'm already away from it," Briggs replied, frustration finally creeping into his voice. "What more do you need?" Reich's hand went to his belt, fingers brushing the handcuffs clipped there. "We need you detained until we verify ownership." The word sent a chill through the parking lot. Detained, not questioned, not asked for documents, detained like a criminal. "You have no grounds to detain me," Briggs stated, his legal expertise cutting through the absurdity of the moment. "We'll see about that," Reick muttered. The phones recording from the edges of the lot captured everything. The buzzing fluorescent lights, the rigid stances of the officers, and the moment when Reich's fingers closed around the handcuffs and lifted them from his belt. Briggs saw the gesture. He took a single step backward, not in aggression but in self-preservation. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Reick stepped forward, closing the distance. "And you're resisting." "I am not resisting," Briggs said sharply, his voice rising for the first time. "I am standing still and stating my rights." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. The crowd pressed closer. The cameras kept rolling. And in that moment, Judge Nathaniel Briggs made a decision. He reached slowly into his inner coat pocket, his movements visible and controlled, and withdrew a leather ID case. He opened it and held it directly in front of Reich's face. The gold emblem caught the light, unmistakable and undeniable. Officer Jansen saw it first. His entire demeanor shifted, eyes widening, posture straightening, the confidence draining from his expression like water through a sieve. Reick stared at the badge, and for the first time since he'd pulled into the gas station, his certainty faltered. The emblem was official, stay-tissued, carrying a title that removed every assumption he'd made. Honorable Nathaniel Briggs, State Superior Court Judge. "You're a judge," Reick said, the words barely a whisper. "And you," Briggs replied, his voice cold with controlled fury, "are violating multiple rights on camera." The silence that followed was deafening. Reich's hand slowly lowered the handcuffs, but the body cam captured the tremor in his fingers, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden, crushing realization that everything he'd done was now documented against someone with the authority to dismantle his career. Jansen shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we didn't know." "You didn't need to know my title to treat me lawfully," Briggs cut him off, his words precise and devastating. "Every citizen deserves the same respect you would show a judge. That's the entire point of the law." Both officers stood frozen, suddenly uncertain of their next move. The gas station had grown quiet except for the hum of the fuel pumps and the distant rush of highway traffic. Briggs closed his ID wallet with a decisive snap. "Now I expect to leave without further harassment." Reick cleared his throat, grasping for any shred of justification. "We were just doing our job." "No," Briggs replied, his tone as sharp as broken glass. "You created a crime where none existed." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. One of the witnesses, a middle-aged man in a construction vest, stepped forward slightly. "I got everything recorded," he announced. "If you need a copy, I can send it." Briggs nodded once. "Thank you." The simple exchange, calm, respectful, cooperative, seemed to unsettle Reick even further. He turned toward the witness, his authority crumbling. "This is an active investigation. Stop recording." The man didn't lower his phone. "This is a public place." Another blow, another moment captured on multiple devices. The truth was no longer something that could be buried or dismissed. The officers backed away, creating the space they should have maintained from the beginning. With deliberate, unhurried movements, Judge Briggs returned to his Range Rover and retrieved the registration and insurance documents from the glove compartment, the same paperwork he'd offered to show before the situation spiraled out of control. He handed them to Jansen. "Verify it now." Jansen scanned the documents, his face pale. Every detail matched perfectly. The vehicle wasn't stolen. There had never been a report. There had never been any legitimate reason for this stop. He exhaled slowly and returned the papers. "Everything's valid." Briggs didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. He simply said, "I know." Reick couldn't meet his eyes. His jaw twitched with suppressed frustration or shame, perhaps both. "You're free to go," the officer muttered. Briggs held Reich's gaze for a long moment, then spoke with the same authority he wielded from the bench. "Officer Reick, I advise you to document your actions tonight carefully. You'll be asked to repeat them under oath." The officer's shoulders slumped. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the dawning horror of consequences. Briggs stepped into his Range Rover, started the engine, and drove away with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. The crowd watched in silence as his taillights disappeared down Highway 19. But the story was far from over. By the next morning, witness footage had spread across social media like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up within hours. By afternoon, national outlets were running segments with titles like "Judge Profiled at Gas Station" and "Unlawful Detention Caught on Camera." The video was dissected frame by frame, every word of the officer's statement scrutinized against the backdrop of their actions. Civil rights attorneys contacted Judge Briggs before noon. Community leaders demanded accountability. The State Judicial Board released a statement of support. Even members of law enforcement expressed concern about the incident, recognizing the damage it did to public trust. Within 48 hours, an official investigation into Officer Mark Reick was launched. But it didn't stop with one night's confrontation. Investigators uncovered patterns, previous complaints, unreported stops, multiple accusations of targeting drivers based on the vehicles they drove and the color of their skin. 5 days after the gas station encounter, Judge Nathaniel Briggs filed a lawsuit. The number that appeared in court documents sent shockwaves through the city: $13.8 million. The filing was methodical, devastating in its precision. Unlawful detention, racial profiling, violation of constitutional rights, emotional distress. Every claim was supported by video evidence, witness testimony, and the officer's own recorded words. The city's attorneys reviewed the footage and came to a swift conclusion: this was indefensible. The body cam showed Reich's late activation, his baseless accusations, his refusal to accept documentation. The gas station cameras captured the aggressive positioning, the threatening gestures, the moment the handcuffs were drawn. The witness videos showed the crowd's reaction, the fear and anger of people watching injustice unfold in real time. Fighting the lawsuit wasn't an option. Settling was the only path forward. 3 months later, the city quietly agreed to the full amount, but the settlement was only part of the story. Officer Mark Reick was terminated. His personnel file, once protected by union regulations and department loyalty, was open to public scrutiny. The pattern of behavior was undeniable. Officer Jansen received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining. Lieutenant Harris, who had eventually arrived to de-escalate the situation, was placed in charge of overhauling the department's policies on traffic stops and probable cause. And the gas station where it all happened installed a small plaque near Pump 4, "All areas under 24-hour surveillance. Audio and video recorded for your protection." Judge Nathaniel Briggs returned to work without fanfare. No press conferences. No victory speeches. He simply walked back into his courtroom and resumed his duties with the same quiet authority he'd always possessed. But something had changed. In his interactions with defendants, with attorneys, with law enforcement officers who appeared before him, there was a new dimension to his understanding. He'd always been fair, always been measured. But now he carried lived experience of what happened when the system failed, when assumptions replaced evidence, when power was wielded without accountability. In his closing remarks at a legal conference 6 months after the incident, Judge Briggs addressed a room full of attorneys, judges, and law enforcement officials. His words were simple but powerful. "I wasn't looking for a fight that night, I was looking for respect. The same respect every person deserves when they interact with those who are sworn to protect them. My title shouldn't have mattered, my credentials shouldn't have been necessary, the color of my skin should never have been a factor. What should have mattered was the law applied equally, fairly, without prejudice." His voice didn't shake, his expression didn't harden. He simply spoke the truth that millions had witnessed through their screens. When we allow assumptions to replace evidence, when we permit profiling to masquerade as policing, we don't just fail individuals, we fail the entire system. And the only way forward is through transparency, accountability, and the unwavering commitment to treat every human being with the dignity they deserve. The room erupted in applause, but Briggs didn't smile. He simply nodded, gathered his notes, and walked off the stage. Because for him, this wasn't about recognition or vindication. It was about change. Real, lasting change that would ensure no one else had to pull out a badge to prove they deserved basic respect. The gas station on Highway 19 still operates today. Travelers stop for fuel, grab snacks, use the restrooms. Most don't know the history of Pump 4 or the confrontation that unfolded there under the fluorescent lights. But for those who do know, for those who watched the videos and followed the story, that gas station represents something more than a place to refuel. It's a reminder that justice isn't confined to courtrooms, that cameras don't blink, that truth, once captured and shared, becomes impossible to ignore. And that sometimes, the most powerful moments of change happen not in grand gestures or historic legislation, but in ordinary places where ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, one calm, measured word at a time.